So Marx is against this form of globalism, but he's not against internationalism. And in fact, his view of internationalism is going to align in certain ways more closely with that of Kant. Right? The dream for Marx is a communist international. This would not mean that a single ruling class would control the workforce of the entire world, as the capitalist international imagines it, but a global order in which all people control their own labor. Right? So, just as Kant thinks in the kingdom of ends, we would imagine each person as an end in themselves. So Marx would imagine that in a communist international, each worker would, around the globe, own their own products, right? Be the means to their own ends rather than the means to someone else's ends. So the capitalist, globalist vision is one in which a single ruling class, the same bourgeois class, controls the workforce around the world, right? Who owns the workforce in China? Who pays the workforce in China? American capitalists, right? That is the expansion of the capitalist class globally. So I think we can talk about lots of different objections to communism, and maybe we can deal with those a little bit in our Zoom tomorrow. And I'll say that this is really just a primer to Marx, and if you're interested, there's lots more to read, right? One of the common objections that people have is, well, some jobs have a higher labor or exchange value, some jobs require more training, more talent, and some jobs are simply more valuable. How could a doctor and a janitor be paid the same? And maybe I covered this a little bit in a previous lecture, right? These differences don't need to be exacerbated by a system that puts workers and management in opposition, would be the key point here, right? That some jobs would be paid more than others is possible without there being a fundamental separation between owners and workers, management and employees. Sorry for that little tangent, but so in the final word I want to say about global capital, Marx writes again on page, I think it's 17, a society that has conjured up, we have become a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange that is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. In other words, by making the capitalist system global, we've lost control of it. Right? We are no longer able to control the forces of capitalism, except, Kant thinks, through the revolt of the proletariat. Now, this is obviously the most controversial and most radical and sort of quote-unquote dangerous of Marx's ideas, but Marx calls explicitly in the Communist Manifesto for a revolt against the bourgeois class by the proletariat. He calls for this ongoing class warfare to be recognized as class warfare and engaged in by the proletariat as a unified bloc. Right? So what Marx foresees is the necessity that workers unify, form unions, collectivize, and form their own party. And that the union, the total union of workers, would easily be able to overthrow the bourgeois class. Right? Now, Marx, as an historical materialist, as someone who believes that these sorts of developments require historical time, believes that this unification of the proletariat, of the working classes, will come slowly, right? But by the time that he's writing in the mid-19th century, it's already well underway. So he says, the proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operative of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. So first, this fight is carried on by an individual laborer, right? The first laborer who protests, who quits, right? The first laborer who destroys a piece of factory equipment in protest. That is the beginning of the fight, right? The first stage of the development of the unification of the working classes. But this one laborer, singular act of protest, sparks more and begins the process of unification, begins the process of solidarity, right? The beginning of solidarity among workers. Then an entire work people of a factory, right? Workers will cease production. Right? And when the workers stop working, the factory has no products. Without products, it makes no profits. Right? So obviously, the factory is nothing without the workers. And as soon as the workers realize that the capitalists need the workers, but much more than the workers need the capitalists, then the workers see their power, right? Their ability to exert power and leverage over the owner class. And so a union is the way that workers band together to gain leverage over management. And this one factory then spreads to one trade, right? Our glove factory, you all go on strike for higher wages. And I realize that I can't find any other workers to replace you. Maybe you are, preventing the scabs from coming in and taking your jobs. Your pressure has worked, and I raise your wages. Right? You win. Word spreads to the other glove factory workers, and the glove factory in the next county over goes on strike, and the same thing happens. Right? Then word spreads to the shoe factories, so on and so forth. Right? The word spreads. Now, what is the nature of these protests? They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. Right? They destroy the machines they work with. One of the most famous early factory protests was in the textile industry, where factory workers destroyed all the looms which are used to make textiles. Right? And this act, this protest, the destruction of the looms, was the beginning of the Luddites. Luddites are those who are against technology. Now, that's not Marx's position. Marx is not a Luddite. It's just an interesting example of this kind of protest, right? The destruction of the instruments of production that are owned by the owner class. Right? So not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but the instruments of production. So to actually destroy the instruments by which the bourgeois are able to exploit the workers, right? Destroy the factory itself, right? Destroy the means of production in some sense. Property destruction, property damage. This is, we see, this, the effect of Marx, certainly, and Marxist thought in action when people, for example, get more upset about the windows that are broken during a protest about police violence than about the police violence itself. Right? If a police officer kills a black person, right, and there is a protest where the windows of your local Chase Bank are smashed, the Twitter sphere, the media, talking heads, the sort of common sense reaction is likely to be that the protesters are to be blamed, right? That the property destruction is going to be, condemned much in much starker, more black and white terms than the police brutality, right? And we could say endless amounts about this, but now I think the thing to say is, again, the instruments of production are more valuable to the ruling class, the bourgeois class, than the workers themselves, than the people who work for them. Right? The people can be replaced. The people are seen only as their monetary value, and the instruments are more valuable than they are. The other ways of protesting or rebellion are setting factories ablaze, right? Not just smashing machinery, but destroying whole factories. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workman of the Middle Ages.